The cause-effect relationships are by and large timeless. There's evolution. Evolution is how something changes over a period of time. And then around those things are these cycles, because if they're put in the same position, let's say a Federal Reserve is put into a position of having to decide, do you have defaults or do you print money? There's a choice, and that choice repeats over history. And so you can see what are the indicators of that position and what are the reactions and what are the choices. So the cause-effect relationships, by and large, remain the same through history. But there's always a reason. We're changing the world order, okay? In 1945, we started the New World Order. What I mean is, throughout history, there's a fight for control, because there's no world court that you go to and plead your case. And so there's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. And so 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power. So the U.S. set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank. And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Things evolve. Things change over history. So the three big things that are changing now that haven't occurred in our lifetime is the amount of debt and money creation, which affects the value of money, and you could see it affecting what's going on every day. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money, and that produces inflation. That's the place we are at this moment. Okay. The second is when there's a great internal conflict, usually when there's a large wealth and values gap, at the same time as you have a financial problem. Then you get populism of the left and populism of the right. In other words, those who feel disenfranchised want people who are going to fight for them. They don't want compromisers. They don't want them to be in the middle, because middle means that they're not fighting for them. They want them to have guts. So you have populists of the left, and their positions harden, and there are no compromises. That's why we're potentially in a situation that you could see in one of these elections, maybe in 2024, that neither side would accept losing. Perhaps we see that. Maybe you don't follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. Anyway, these things have not happened in our lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So if you look at that, you see from those patterns why the gaps become greater and the positions harden, and you see the dynamic. So that's the second. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of how the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars. And they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. I think that there's a tendency to look at the economy in a rearview mirror, seeing low levels of inflation and also not understanding monetary inflation. There are 2 types of inflation. There's an inflation when the demand is pressing up against the ability to produce. So we had that kind of inflation. Unemployment rates go down and there's a limit to the capacity to produce. There's also a monetary inflation. And a monetary inflation means, very simply, if you produce more money in credit, if that increase is greater than the production of the goods and services, prices will go up. It creates a spiral, which we're seeing now. In other words, the selling of bonds. So it makes the imbalance become greater, because not only do you sell the bonds to pay for the deficit governments do, but holders of bonds choose to sell bonds because they're not producing a good real return. Now, that just mechanistically may be a little bit tricky for some people, but what that means is when you have a big supply-demand imbalance like that, either interest rates have got to go up to curtail that demand, or the central bank has to print more money, and they always print more money. So that dynamic of monetary inflation, the type of thing that makes the 70s, or the type of thing that makes inflationary depressions like happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany in early 1920s, that kind of inflation I don't think is paid enough attention to. Inevitably, there's a certain amount of debt that has to be paid. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And the more debt you have, the bigger the problem is. And so when you have a lot of debt and you have to pay it back, you're either going to pay it back in hard money or you're going to pay it back in depreciated money. And that becomes the choice of the central bank. That's why you get stagflations. That's why we have an environment like we have now. You have economic weakness.
Our national debt is skyrocketing. Wars are going on around the world. Major banks are all forecasting sizable rate cuts in an election year. Donald Trump warned the U.S. dollar, no longer being the world standard, will be our greatest defeat in 200 years. The good news is, you can take advantage of this situation, seeing a direct correlation here. The smartest world-class investors are adding physical gold and silver to their portfolios, and it's paying off big time. National Gold Group is America's #1 precious metals company. National Gold Group has the IRA Fee Waiver Program. That means they will pay the fees on your IRA for up to 10 years on qualifying rollovers. Call 888-599-2883 to learn about their retirement account fee waiver program. Mention Free Investing and you'll always get best-in-class service from America's conservative precious metals leader. You can also go to their website, buyfigold.com, using the link in this video description.
You have a stagnant economy, low growth, and with high inflation. And that happens through this monetary situation that I'm describing, in which the central bank tries to deal with a middle course. In other words, what does the central bank want? Not too high inflation and not too low growth. And so when there's a lot of debt, because one man's debts are another man's assets, it becomes very difficult, a balancing act. And that is when you have stagflation, when you produce it. So just like in the 1960s, late 60s, we spent a lot of money on guns and butter, we called it, right. The Vietnam War, social programs and so on. We wrote too many checks relative to the money we had in the bank, which was gold at the time. 1971, the devaluation. Then they print a lot of money into that stagflation. So stagflation is the middle course when there's two different. So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies, and how do you fight inflation? The way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them. Right. So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds, right. And then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. The buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again, to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost, and that is stagflation. I want to explain inflation in a very simple way. There's a certain quantity of buying, that is of how much money and credit you're given, divided by the amount of quantity of goods and services sold. In other words, if there's a lot more money and credit produced than there is goods and services produced, you will have an inflation, and the magnitude will be a function of that ratio. Over that period of time, there was a very enormous amount of money and credit that was produced, and there were some bottlenecks and shortages of production and disruption because of mostly of a combination of COVID and also geopolitical issues. Yeah. So there was some effect. Most of the inflation came from the production. We attribute it. We can go down to actually calculate it. Most of that was due to the enormous increase in money and credit and spending that was produced. If you now look at the United States, it's no longer dominant militarily. It's no longer dominant economically because China has become comparable and is a larger trading partner with other countries than the United States is, the amount of trade and so on. It's a very unique power. Think about it. You can print the money that the world will accept. Now that means when they accept it, they buy your bonds, they buy your debt. That's what they hold these in, which are promises to receive this currency that you could print. So there are two things now that are jeopardizing that position. Dollar's now strong, but there are two things, we want to hold on to that position. Two things that threaten it. First is the printing and devaluing money, but all countries right now are doing it. So in all countries, currencies are depreciating against goods and services prices. And then the other issue, which is interesting, is the weaponization of the dollar in the form of sanctions. America is certainly in relative decline. In other words, has been. Education is not the same. Military power is not the same. Economic power is not the same. If we're looking at, how we're behaving with each other, it is not the same. This is the question. All currencies, usually during these period of time, depreciate together. So in the 1930s, all the currencies depreciate. They depreciated then against gold. They depreciate against assets, against real estate prices and a number of things. But we're coming into a new world in which the real question is what will be the new currency? And it may not be just a government currency. Is it crypto? Is it gold? Is it other things? And we'll find out. So a currency is a medium of exchange, and we'll have all of those currencies continue to be, including the dollar. But it's also a storehold of wealth. And that means that the bonds, or what you store it in, has to have a real return. And none of the major currencies have that. That's why you're seeing movements out of all of those and into other assets, and why you're seeing the bond market sell off. The production is now going based on ideological and political considerations. In other words, I talked about self-sufficiency. If you look at China will be self-sufficient. The United States will be self-sufficient. Multinational companies are going to worry about where they're going to have trade and so on. So the notion of how do I deal with self-sufficiency? We're in a world where ideological and political forces are allocating resources more than economic. Given the risks in the world, they want to be self-sufficient. And similarly, the United States wants to be more self-sufficient, and other countries are wanting to be more self-sufficient because they're worried about being cut off. It's the nature of the beast. Capitalism is a fabulous way of allocating resources to get rich, but it gets people at different rates. They get very big differences, and also produces a lot of debt. That's part of the capitalist process. And so when there's this large debt and when there's a large wealth gap, people feel disenfranchised. So it happened in Europe. 4 major democracies chose autocracies because of the fight between the left and the right. Then they called it fascism and communism. But those two, the right and the left, and how to deal with it has always happened. So you go back to the French Revolution. In all of those cases, there were moderates. There were people in the middle who said we have issues and we have to deal with those types of issues. But the polarity becomes greater. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. You know how it is. How did Donald Trump get elected? What was the characteristics of the population? You can go back and you could see that. So you have fighters on both sides who
do not want to compromise.
They don't want, it's considered weak. And if you're in the middle, you will have to pick a side and fight. There's the loss of the middle. What we need right now, in my opinion, is a strong middle. You need a strong middle, but you also have a political system where you have 2 parties. And because of those 2 parties, there's a tendency to become more and more extreme because those extremities on each part of their party become stronger to win a nomination. Measures of extremism is that, roughly speaking, about 30% of the population is rather extreme of the right, and about 15% is extreme of the left. Of course, that represents then the majority of the Republican Party is in that category, and then a very important part of the Democratic Party is
on the left.
Yet the majority of Americans are in the middle. So you still have, given those numbers, they add up to maybe 40 or 45% of the population. But we don't have a party in the middle. You don't have a middle. Investing in education and infrastructure through history have been the most important ingredients. You can't make better investments than in education and infrastructure. They pay and they produce a more broad-based prosperity. But we don't do that because of certain reasons, the Constitution and the like. But in order to do that, you need a platform of the middle. You need a spokesman, I think, that draws people away from the extremes toward the middle. If you did have a third political party, and I'm not saying that's practical, but I would say then you could have a platform, and then you could have somebody that you could look at, or candidates that say, I am for the middle, and that would help to neutralize. Because otherwise, history has shown you go to greater and greater extremism, and then you have the battle. And I think that that's what we should be afraid of most, is that those extremists in a battle having a type of civil war, which I think there's a reasonable chance of. When I say a civil war, I think that the rule of law and constitution can be of diminished value relative to power, such as in the elections, neither side accepting losing, such as the Supreme Court makes rulings that are not followed by states, such as population moving from one state to another because the values in that other state are more there. So then it becomes a make me type of situation. Rather than saying, what is the law? It says, make me do that thing. And now when we lose that kind of rule of law and respect for the whole, I think that's a type of civil war. When you watch that, who knows where that leads? It could lead to violence. The whole idea in the Constitution of holding arms, and how many, there are more arms than there are people, and so on. And when you get into a make-me mentality, you could get into an armed situation where a lot of people and guns and crazy things. I'm not going that far, but I'm saying let's bring that back a notch and talk about, can we imagine, you and I, we know history, and we look at today, and it's different. Could we see the failure of following the rule of law and the Constitution? So somebody gets elected and you now know who's going to be in the seat, or you don't follow that and you get into a power-based situation? Yes, there's a possibility. And the fact that we consider that to be a significant possibility, I put the odds of something like that at about 40%. History has also shown, and we see it, that people have to pick a side. They pick a side and they speak to it. So you watch in the media. Do you get unbiased reporting? It's hard to come by. Even exchanges of thoughts. It wasn't like this. Even the issue, let's say, of Disney in Florida. In the past, each should have a different perspective. You wouldn't weaponize. You wouldn't retaliate to the same extent that we're retaliating with exercises of power and so on. You have to benefit the majority of the people. It's narrowing. Just by any of the measures, since 1980, per capita income for the bottom 60% of the population has not risen. If you ask surveys, it's a failure. Every system needs to be improved and modified and made better. And I'm a mechanic. So I just look at the cause-effect relationship. It is because there is an element in which the reinvestment of gains do not go down to create the basics. What are the basics? Here's all you need. Parents who will take good care of you, a good public education system, and equal opportunity. That's all you need, as existed throughout history. You give those things to people, and by and large, you have a much more prosperous, you could draw the talent from wherever it is. So those are the things. And we're in a spiral. Because also the children who grow up in some of these areas from childhood, and they don't have the parents, they don't have the circumstances in terms of the basic equal education and so on. And that population is a growing population. And so we see then the disenfranchised. Other issues is because that population. So let's just go back. How did Donald Trump get elected as president? There was a population that was a disenfranchised population that wanted somebody who was going to fight for him, like populists do. The profit system alone is not good enough. The history of these situations make one worry about such things because the conflict and so on goes through a difficult time. I believe that we're at a moment in which we have a choice, and it largely depends on how we are with each other.
We being Americans.
Americans, and then we being, it could be Americans and Chinese, but we as humans have a choice of how we are going to be with each other. The world has more resources than it has ever had. It has more wealth than it has ever had. It has inventiveness that will produce fabulous gains, and that'll continue. But the issue is really, are we going to be dealing with that as a together society? It's very simple. Don't go to war with each other. Work together, right? Don't go to war. If you do that and you realize we're all in this together, and then I don't care how you get there in terms of that element. I do believe in thoughtful disagreement, the art of thoughtful disagreement. I believe in win-win relationships, not lose-lose relationships. And my principle is, if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry.
You need to worry.
Because if you worry, you will do the things that prevent you from happening the thing you're worrying about. So, for example, if I look at the term civil war, and I look at the term international war, and I can paint a picture, a realistic picture of what that looks like, so the people really see it, like the people who went through those wars in history saw it. If I can paint that picture and then say, one thing we can agree on is we don't want that. Okay, we do not want that. So how? That's why I would like to see in the United States, I'd like to see us get strong. I'd like to see a strong middle. Anybody who has gone through a war, this is true for history, you see what happens is the polarity becomes so great that there's no talking. There's just mutual intimidation and there's a fight. And you get beyond the stage and the middle gets lost. There's the capacity, a lot of capacity to increase the size of the pie and divide it better. And I'm a capitalist. So I don't mean just handing out money wastefully, but I mean there's so many opportunities to improve productivity and produce opportunity in various ways that I just can't believe that we're not doing it, and we could do it.
You point out in the book that often a rising power and a declining power, where they cross, end up in a war. Do you believe China and the United States are going to end up in a war?
I believe that there's a significant risk of it, but I don't think it's probable. As I say, well, there are 5 types of wars. We're in 4 of them.
Right.
And we're at the edge of a 5th.
Which is a shooting war.
That's right. So we are in a trade war, we are in a technology war, we are in a geopolitical influence war, and we are to some extent a capital and economic war. We are there. And we are dealing with military issues, particularly as they pertain to Taiwan. We're close.
Could Taiwan be the thing that led us to war?
If we go to a military war, it'll almost certainly be the Taiwan issue. I think we want to contain China. Their concerns are mostly the domestic concerns. How do they deal with the demographics issue? How do they deal with their own domestic issues? You know, when you run a country, The major issues are the internal issues. How do you make sure you deal with corruption? How do you deal with all the issues that they face? Poverty in the western part of China, environmental issues, the property bubble that's bursting, the COVID issue. So look at it this way. It's a big thing. The population in China, the capitas, are more than 4 times that in the United States. Since I started going to China in 1984, per capita income has increased by 27 times. If it increased to half of what the United States is, that would mean its economy would be twice the size of the United States. So it's a big force. The main reason that China did not denominate its exports and trade in the currency and did not denominate its lending is that they didn't want to be a threat to the United States, because that's a threatening act. If the United States loses, now we were in a different era then, just to explain it. They became the largest trading country in the world. In other words, did more trade than any other. They could have operated in their currency. In terms of lending, international lending, they're the largest lenders, and they could have done that in their currency. They chose not to because they perceived that that would be a threat. They were not trying to disrupt the world order. But now we have a different set of circumstances worldwide. This leadership was the same, of the same mind. And I think is pretty much today, they don't want to disrupt the world order, but they want to be as great as they can be. They want to be as rich and powerful and so on. But they don't want to disrupt the world order. If you look at history and you understand international relations, which is very much like Confucianism, what you have is called a tribute system. And that means each country is in the place, they know their place. They know the hierarchy. Like in the old days, it's almost like other countries would be almost a vassal state. You would say, I know that you have the power, you pay respect, and you operate in a harmonious way. But the idea of war is a horrendous idea. So I think that they would probably be just as happy if you divided the world in half, their half and we had our half, and there was peace in the world. I'm just saying an objective is not to dominate the world. An objective is to operate in a way where there is no such war. However, that they are as strong and powerful and healthy and prosperous as they can be. I think it's very difficult for a lot of Americans who hold close to them the treasured, I live the American dream. I know equal opportunity. I know the ability to speak up. I know that those types of values. But it's difficult for other Americans to understand why they have a different point of view about what works better. A very good example of a cultural case. I think it was the NBA team, an individual spoke out on Hong Kong, and the Chinese not only punished that team, but they punished the NBA. And in our, like I would say, everyone should have the right to their opinions and to be able to have free expression. In their view, if somebody's doing something wrong, that they will punish the group. They'll punish the family because the group is supposed to be responsible for that. They don't understand it from the internal values way having to do with Confucianism, the history, why it's more autocratic, top-down, what they believe about democracy.
The Chinese leadership is paranoid mostly about maintaining the power of the Communist Party.
Well, they would view that as very similar to us saying the power of the Constitution, because that is the system, that's the order. In 1949, they made a system. And that's the system. When we think of party, we think of that same multiple party type of thing. They think of it as very top-down, very hierarchical. And it's like the family. Vice President of China, Wang Qishan, described it to me. He said, it's top-down, Americans are bottom-up. And the question is, by the way, we have this issue, are we fighting for that ideology? These are bigger questions. Are we fighting for a democracy and capitalism? Or do we believe that others can find their own approaches and may the best approach win out? That becomes a big question as we pursue it. So that is their approach. May not be my approach. They will not give that approach up any more than Americans would give up the Constitution, let's say, or their freedom of speech up. So we just have to understand it's like a religion. You know, as we have different religions all around the world, they're deeply held beliefs, and each believes in that they're going to get the right outcomes by pursuing them. And what do you do about that?
There's also the question of human rights. And clearly, the Chinese have a different view than a lot of people around the world. How do you approach that?
Well, there's me and there's every one of us. It's a cosmic question. Every one of us who buys products or all the businesses that are operating and interacting with China or operating in many countries, I could list a number of countries, the interconnectedness of the relationships with China. We import 22% of our manufactured goods comes from China. If you're buying your Apple or you're buying your sneakers, you're in a position that's somewhat similar to me in terms of thinking about what the issues are. What I do is I rely on the guidance of the government, both governments. I think in studying their dynasties, I studied the Tang dynasty, which is around 600, and I studied also other societies. It is the things that I've talked about before. It is in broad-based education. That Confucian system was the first meritocracy that came in to create broad-based education, and then they would have exams, and the people who would get the jobs would be the people who were the most capable, and they got away from corruption and those types of things. I wouldn't characterize some things as Chinese. I think that in the history of China, there have been good dynasties and there have been bad dynasties, but there's always the common ingredients of what makes a country successful, and they've been that way uniquely. If you do look at the history, I've studied the powers and the different strengths. China has hit through history up until around 1840, been always like number one or two in the country because of hard work, because of meritocracy, because of being highly civilized. In other words, they are working in the same direction and they operate well to be productive together. Those are the same elements, but it's not just Chinese. If you go back to many empires and many civilizations, those elements have been the timeless and universal elements that have been the source of success. But of course, there's always a balance between being a revolutionary. It's always how far do you take it? So in China right now, there's entrepreneurship, investing in all the ways, empowering, and it's really a capitalist type of approach among entrepreneurship, but they'll call it state capitalism, that kind of an approach. And then there's the question of order. So it is always in getting that balance correctly, because you can have disorder. Like in the United States, we could have enough disorder that could be disruptive to that process. So it's always the issue of getting that balance right. Right now, I think the tilt in China has been a bit more autocratic. And so they're trying to strike this balance with also creating what they call Little Giants program for entrepreneurship and so on. I think it's become too much that way. And I think just in the United States, we're becoming a little disorderly.
Is there any dissent in China?
Oh, dissent. There's not the same kind of open dissent as there is in the United States in terms of how people can speak as freely, nor the media speaking freely, or even listening to things. No. Dissent is more under the surface, particularly now. The leadership evolved greatly also by the circumstances. When he first came to power about 9 years ago, there were two big issues. Corruption. And that the system, 5 major banks lent to state-owned enterprises and local governments, and there was no capital market for small, medium-sized businesses and entrepreneurship. And so if you take on the progress they made tremendous progress along those lines. They now have capital markets, and they've done a tremendous job of reducing.
In a country which is ruled by the Communist Party.
Right. But in their way of doing it, which is that it's run like a company, sort of. There's a board and they operate that way. But in that time, there was a move toward more, at first, 2 5-year terms. So when they moved into the second 5-year term, because of infighting, there was this, what they call core management. So there are 7 standing members of the Politburo, and 4 of them became more the allies of Xi Jinping. And there is a belief that they're going into a more challenging environment. And then they had the series of challenging, and it's become more autocratic than it was before, more nationalistic. I would say they feel more threatened, and it's created more nationalism. So we've begun this dynamic where it's no longer a win-win relationship. It's more like a chess game. In other words, where do you put the pressures on? We're in a war. The power of man, it's in man's hands to be able to work well together and to come up with the inventiveness. If we did those things well, I'm not worried at all. The acts of nature being such a dominant thing, I didn't know that, and then I saw that. There are charts in that book that shows life expectancy, shows per capita GDP, and seeing that these things would last, maybe they're 10 years, maybe they're 5 to 10 years, really terrible wars and so on, but they don't kill most people, and most people get through them one way or another, and then they pass, and then you move on to a higher living standard. And so that arc just always keeps coming up because of man's adaptability and inventiveness. The power of that also came through loud and clear, and that's why I keep coming back to the point that man has that power, and also it just comes down to using that power and being good with each other. It very much depends on the people too, that the people play an important role. The dynamic between what the people allow or demand of their leaders is very important. It's not just the leader. But what I learned about leadership was good leadership varied according to the time and the circumstances that existed. So for example, Adenauer, who was one of the great leaders in Henry's point of view, what came about after a country lost a war, and it required a certain type of great man for that particular time. And so as time change and circumstances change, the definition of what a great leader changes. But a great leader, in any case, understands the circumstances and has the vision to carry that forward, and that there's a dynamic with the population And so can you get the population behind you even when it's a disorderly population? That becomes the great question. Can there be great leadership?
Unbalanced, having really looked at dynasties and looked at history and examined it and looked for the lessons, and think about the moment we are in at this moment. I'm thinking primarily of the United States. Optimistic or pessimistic?
Concerned.
Sure.
It goes back to the point before. I would say I would be more pessimistic than optimistic, but I believe the power is in the population. If they find a strong middle, if they work together. 1971, I was clerking on the floor of the stock exchange, and Nixon got on television on Sunday night, and I watched him tell the country and tell the world that the promise to take paper dollars and turn them in for gold was going to be defaulted on. And I was shocked.
Like
Never experienced that in my lifetime. I went on the floor of the stock exchange. I thought it would go down a lot. It went up a lot. I was wrong. So I studied history, and the exact same thing happened on March 5th, 1933 by Roosevelt doing it over the radio, the exact same thing. And so that taught me that I needed to do that. Of course, I needed to study the Great Depression. I needed to study the 1929 to 33 period. And it happened in exactly the same way. Exactly. A debt crisis when you hit zero interest rates and the Federal Reserve couldn't ease anymore. And I saw that. And for the first time since then, in 2008, the Federal Reserve printed a lot of money and bought a lot of financial assets. I would not have understood that if I didn't understand that 1929 to 33 period. So I learned the lesson, but I like to do it as though I'm going through the real experience. I like to not read history in retrospect, but read the papers as things are transpiring and imagine that I'm going through it. So elements, I think, of a currency that I think that are important is, can you buy and sell things all around the world with it? Is it going to be private currency, that you're not dependent on others? Like gold, one of the things about gold is it has intrinsic value. So because of that, it's perceived intrinsic value, but you're not looking for a payment for somebody. Whereas in others, you have to have money coming in some exchange, that the government can't control it. And we're in an environment now when you have a currency that's a threat. It's so good that it's a threat to the existing currency. Governments will outlaw it. And they have done that with Bitcoin in a number of places, including China. And I think that they have those vulnerabilities, the digital currencies, they have that. I have a tiny bit of it. There's always something new, and I really need to experience it. I need to learn about it, and I never know for sure that that's not the one that's going to be there. So I have a little bit in the portfolio. Because when you start to think about what are the currencies that have those qualities I'm talking about, that you can keep them, that you can go around the world and so on, what are they? They are very limited in number.
National Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer. Call 888-599-2883, 2883, 2883, 2883.
We should be very scared. What comes next is terrible. And the risks of that are great during the times that we are in. I didn't know really about the five big forces, but what I did learn a long time ago is that things that surprised me often surprised me because they never happened in my lifetime, but they happened many times in history. There were three big things: the enormous amount of debt creation. Are there limits to debt creation? And the amount of printing of money. The second was the internal conflict, which we must agree is unique. The populism of the left and the right, the wealth gaps, the values gaps. And the third, of course, was the great power conflict. Not since the 1930 to 45 period did we have those three things. But I needed to study the rises and declines of reserve currencies, the implications of debt and all of that. So that's why I studied the last 500 years and saw those patterns. In doing that, I also saw that droughts, floods, and pandemics, in other words, acts of nature, had a bigger effect, killing more people, causing more empires to decline than the first three I mentioned. And when we look at climate, of course, it's a big issue. And then number five is man's development of technologies. So I saw when those five, how they interacted and how they worked together to create these big cycles. That was enlightening. So that's why I did the study, to understand today, not the past. And you see these sequences. And so it is now transpiring. The most important question regarding all of this, finance, money, inflation, and the value of financial assets, is, are there limits to debt growth? Are there limits to the amount of debt? And how does it work? So we see a pattern over history. A number of years ago, I wrote a book on the principles for dealing with big debt crises. And I looked at the debt crises, all the big ones, over the last 100 years. And I saw this pattern. And I described it: monetary policy 1, 2, and 3. There's a pattern. There's an interest rate policy. Originally, money is tied to gold or something hard, and it keeps it hard. But when there's too much printing of money, too much need for credit, that link doesn't work. And then they break that down, and then we go to an interest rate-driven monetary policy. Raise and lower interest rates, and that's the cost of money, and that rations things. The supply-demand align at that interest rate. However, when interest rates can't be lowered anymore, and there's a situation where there's an imbalance between the demand for bonds, the demand for credit instruments, and the supply of them. In other words, when the supply is offered a lot more than the free market demand, then there's what I call monetary policy 2, which is quantitative easing. In other words, throughout history, the purchases by the central bank, printing of money and the purchasing of those bonds. But when that happens, it helps the owners of those bonds. The bonds go up, owners of financial assets make money, but the money does not get trickled down, does not go to the population that it might be desired to go to. And so we go from monetary policy 1, interest rate policy, monetary policy 2, quantitative easing, to monetary policy 3, when there's a coordination between the fiscal and monetary policy, because a central bank or central government has the ability to tax and spend, but they don't have the ability to create money and credit. Central bank has the ability to create money and credit. If you have to get money into the hands of people, what you need to do is have a coordination between those two things. And of course, that happened in a big way, an enormous way, in 2020 through 2022. And it still really is happening in a large way. So there's the sending out the checks. And then with the sending out the checks, there's the borrowing. And the central governments borrow. And as a result, who do they borrow from? Because there's an imbalance. And so the central bank lends them the money by printing the money. And then we have an inflationary cycle, and we have the nature of the dynamics that we've experienced. So in that piece, I just wanted to show, why is the economy doing relatively well? This amount of interest rate increase, very sharp, very abrupt. But why? And when you look at the composition of that, you could see that the household sector benefited a great deal by that transfer of wealth, because they were given a lot of checks. And then also because of the nature of what's going on with demand, low unemployment rates and higher inflation rates, they benefited from an income point of view. So their incomes were strong, their balance sheets were strong, but that was taken on by the government. And so these things have all happened before repeatedly. That just didn't happen in our lifetimes. And so if you follow those things through and the limitations of debt, okay, how does that mechanics work? Well, of course, one man's debts are another man's financial assets. And if there's not an imbalance, the central banks print money and come in and buy that, and that's what we see. But the nature of that printing of money, as there still needs to be a lot of spending, there needs to be an enormous amount of spending for many, many things, of course. All of that means that that's a lot of debt that the government then gets into. And if you look at history, the central bank tries to achieve a balance. That's why you see a real bond yield now and a real interest rate, which is in, the vicinity of, let's call it 2%. So that's that equilibrium. Now, as we run lower on the savings, we encounter those issues. I want to say that if we're looking at that and we carry that forward, we have a problem. The problem is going to be the existing level of budget deficits and the existing monetization, because the way that this works in the last part of the cycle, the long-term debt cycle, is first that the debt service payments begin to squeeze out the consumption. In other words, as debt becomes a higher percentage of income and interest rates go up, then debt service payments become greater. And as those debt service payments become greater, that squeezes out consumption. And you go to a point where that starts to accelerate in a self-reinforcing problem. That problem precedes the real problem, the bigger problem, which is when owners of the debt see this debt problem emerging and there's a big imbalance. So the central banks come in and print, or they have large losses. And as a result of that, the owners of those want to sell the bonds. So just imagine that. We're seeing that kind of dynamic. The dynamic, consider, for example, the losses of the central banks. All the central banks have significant losses on their bond holdings. And depending on how it's handled, it creates a financial problem. For example, in the UK, those losses by the Bank of England, which account for about 2% of GDP, then have to be funded. And so they go to the central government, and the budget they have to give the fund to central bank, they have to go borrow the money. And as they go borrow the money, then that worsens the supply-demand balance. A very classic dynamic, it happens all the time, is that the central banks themselves get into financial difficulty. Now we think, okay, central banks really can't get into financial difficulty, but yes, they do, because as those losses occur and the money has to come from somewhere, then they get into that need to print more and more, and it starts to accelerate. And you see this in many cases, often in emerging countries, but you saw it with the breakdown of the system in 71, the ERM realignment, and so on. So that becomes the dynamic in which you can't continue to create a lot of debt. Think about the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan has bought an enormous amount of bonds. Think about what those bonds are worth. So now the central bank is in a position. Do they tighten monetary policy? Can they continue to have those levels of borrowing? And do they tighten monetary policy? If interest rates go up, there's a problem for the Bank of Japan. And this is, by the way, true for most central banks in varying degrees. So that is how that dynamic works. When there's the selling of bonds and there is that inability by central banks to do anything, print money to try to keep interest rates, real interest rates low, which makes it a negative to hold those bonds. So other free market owners of those bonds want to sell them. You create that kind of a dynamic. And if they don't print the money and buy the bonds, then you have interest rates rise a lot. So the point is that that debt is not good debt. And as a result, you get into that dynamic. I think we're in the early stages of the last stages, meaning that as we do projections, let's say over the next 5 years, and particularly over the next few years, the supply-demand issue will be probably bringing in central banks. I think the thing to watch now as the red flag would be, okay, central banks switching to quantitative easing again. I think that would be the red flag that'll go up. Through the last couple of hundred years, all currencies encounter this. The reason that we anticipated the 2008 financial crisis and had a depression gauge that we put on was because the exact same thing happened in the 1929 to 32 period of hitting a zero interest rate when there was a credit problem, and then the reaction was exactly the same. So I think it's important to understand these cause-effect relationships, but also see them work in history so that you could see where we are now. Because, yes, when we come down to the basics, what is debt? Debt is a promise to deliver money. Money is debt. Debt is money. In other words, when we say money is debt, you don't hold it in paper cash. You hold it in a debt instrument when you're holding money. And a debt instrument is a promise by the government to give you money. And you say, is it worth a lot to hold? And how much is it? You enter that particular dynamic. I think it's just so important that people understand that dynamic now. Yes, so as we look ahead, is that money real money? It's either going to be paid back with hard money, real money that is going to maintain purchasing power, or it's not, or it's going to be paid back with depreciated money. And in the end, they all devalue or the currencies die. So that creates the nature of what is a monetary inflation. There are two types of inflation. There's the monetary inflation because they create a lot of money and credit and it becomes worthless. Or there's the inflation that comes from too much demand pressing up on too much supply. And the situation now is that dynamic of a monetary inflation. So I really urge to review that chapter in the book and make sure you understand that, because that value of money is such an important thing about the portfolio. And the answer to that is an asset that can move between countries is a real asset, and that is widely accepted around the world. That's the nature of the beast. If we're talking about money, a global money is something that's accepted around the world. You can move it and pay it. And ideally, it's not, there's a saying about gold that it's the only financial asset that you can own that is not somebody else's liability. You have to get something from something. And I'll just point out that it was the Dutch in the 1600s that changed our definition, changed our view of money and financial assets, because then there wasn't a stock market. They invented the first stock in the first stock market, and there wasn't much of a bond market. There was a little bit of lending. And what everybody thought their assets were the things they owned. In other words, if you were rich, you would define that you were rich because you had your house or whatever it is, and you had your business. And they invented the concept that you could buy an interest in income that hasn't yet been made. In other words, I'll buy an interest in a company, and then I will go make the money that I'm going to pay you back with. And that was really the development of financial assets as we know it. And we start to think of assets as being financial assets. And all of those financial assets, all of the financial assets that we have no intrinsic value. They have no purpose intrinsically. You might as well burn them. They're of no use unless you convert them into buying real goods and services. And we lose sight of that. We think that we have a lot of financial assets and we're storing all of our financial assets. So through history, you can see, and it's shown in the book, you'll see a chart of the amount of financial assets relative to the value of real assets. And when there's a large amount of financial assets, claims on the real assets, that becomes a problem in terms of debt service, becomes a problem in that. And so we then go back to the basic question. The basic question that you're asking is, what has real value? And it's almost like musical chairs, because all of this money, when it comes down to it, is like, okay, I got to buy something. Where am I going to be my storehold of wealth? Because it may not be as much in those financial assets, particularly the debt assets, because the debt assets are much worse than the equity assets when they start to print the money. So when you start to think about it, real estate is a problem generally, but it depends where the real estate is. We'll get into the geopolitical in a second, but real estate becomes a problem because it's, first of all, so easily taxed. It's nailed down. Because it's there physically, it's easy to tax. And so it depreciates in value, and you can't pick it up and go buy something in some other country with it. So there starts to think, okay, is it collectibles? Is it works of art? Is it gems? What is it that, in a sense, can move between those places? And then related to that, because of the nature of the cycle, when there's more trouble because of the confluence of the financial, the internal conflict over wealth and values, and then the external conflict, there become legal changes. In other words, foreign exchange controls and abilities to move money from place to place. These become more important issues. They become considerations in the value of what is of value. And so that whole dynamic then makes one think, well, you can figure it out for yourself. You start to think, okay, what will have value and where? You come down to a limited number of choices, right? Gold is one of those choices because it can move from place to place. It's a world money, and, it not requiring somebody to pay, all of that. The characteristics are what I'm trying to convey. And then where it is becomes an important consideration, because in this environment, when you have the internal conflict and then you also have the external conflict, the question is, where are the safe environments? Where are the safe environments that will protect capital versus, let's say capital is not protected? Obviously, money matters to people. When you have a money crisis, and then it's the nature of the system that capitalism will necessarily reward those who come up with, the great ideas and so on, and it creates a wealth gap. And then when it goes from one generation to another generation, then that becomes an unfair thing. And then one man's debts are another man's assets. So there's this financial, and then there's values differences. So you see who gets the money becomes a big issue. And then the values differences become very great. In the 1930 to 45 period, 4 democracies chose to be autocratic leaders. That was Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan, because the conflict became so great and each side had populism. By populism, I mean the not willingness to accept losing. They believe the system isn't fair, and they want to find the people who will fight and win for them. And when they have those people who will fight and win for them, you have irreconcilable differences. Even questions that we're experiencing now. Is the rule of law fair? Is it going to work? If Donald Trump is convicted or Joe Biden is convicted, whatever, do you believe that that's a fair trial? Do both sides accept that? If you accept losing an election, do you accept that? Do you play by the rules, or do you play to win? And so what we're seeing now, that we've seen repeatedly, French Civil War, Russian Civil War, Chinese Civil War, Cuban Civil War, Spanish Civil War, all of these cases are when there are irreconcilable differences and the lack of willingness to accept losing. So as we come into this particular, let's call it the next 2 years, which will take us into the beginning part of the next term, this is going to be one of those sort of great conflict. I mean, who would imagine that the legal questions, such as that are existing, and the sense of, is that fair? What we're seeing seems very unusual to us, yet it's very typical in terms of these cycles. That becomes the dynamic. When that dynamic occurs at the same time as the other dynamics occur, then you have sort of that element of the perfect storm. So, for example, as we're getting into the issue of the geopolitical conflict with China and the sides lining up the way they're lining up, you also realize that the domestic political issue will tend to exacerbate that conflict over that period of time. So that dynamic coming together is a very classic dynamic that seems very unusual to us now. But if you were to read history and read the stories of how it transpired, I think one needs that perspective. What are the great strengths? Democracy means that there's a flexibility. Just abide by the rules. If you obey the rules, then you will get an answer. And everybody says, I surrender to the decision of the majority of the people. And that's a fabulous thing. It's a fabulous that it brings about compromise. It's a fabulous thing that we have rule of law. What happens and the risk is the loss of those things.
Right.
So I'm not against those things. On the contrary, I'm saying cherish those things. Do not lose those things, because if you lose the rule of law and you lose the acceptance of the votes, and that acceptance that we appear is a possibility, that we should be very scared, and that the risks of that are great during such a time that we are in. And so you can see it operating in that way. And in these times where there are irreconcilable differences, you may not like the rules, but please, let's abide by the rules, because when we abandon the rule book, what comes next is terrible. Comes next is terrible. Comes next is terrible.